This blueprint represents the state, not as a moral entity, but as a cold, mechanical engine of incentives and momentum, and it has a leak. The first rule of system design is that you never engineer a machine assuming its operators will be inherently good. The vast majority of people are highly adaptable. They aren't malicious by nature, nor are they saints. They simply mold their behavior to fit the incentives presented to them. In engineering, you don't build locks to stop a master thief. You build them to keep honest, adaptable people honest. If the lock is broken, the temptation to walk through the door eventually overrides the operator's moral compass. In the state machine, the central actuator is the executive branch. It possesses the most raw power, the largest budget, and the greatest momentum. If the internal incentives and structural locks around that actuator are flawed, that adaptable majority will inevitably exploit the mechanism for personal gain rather than public service. We currently rely on the classical three-branch model: executive, legislative, and judicial. It operates as the foundational software of modern democracies, but it is an outdated operating system. This document shows the origin of the separation of powers concept. Montesquieu designed this architecture over 300 years ago for one highly specific purpose: to constrain an absolute monarch. An 18th century architect could not anticipate the capabilities of modern classified intelligence agencies and sprawling security apparatuses. This diagram reveals the fatal structural bug. Because the executive node commands the physical forces of the state, it extends hidden tethers into a dark space of intelligence and security, completely outside the view of the other branches. Operating inside a classified black box means these intelligence forces function without any negative feedback loop or legislative oversight. The data is simply sealed. This systemic mutation produces a shadow government. The state's security apparatus is repurposed into a private enforcement arm for the ruling executive oligarchy. Armed with the state's protective shield, this network actively suppresses political opposition, hides its own operations, and secures permanent power. A three-branch system lacks the internal sensors to self-correct when the executive holds a total monopoly on both state secrets and physical force. This modified blueprint shows the structural solution: a fourth branch. Oversight functions are extracted to construct a distinct control branch, acting as the missing diagnostic sensor. Its internal structure consists of officials answering to no one within the executive or legislative branches. It operates on anarchic redundancy. Multiple independent inspectorates, ombudsmen, auditors, and prosecutors cover the exact same jurisdiction simultaneously. This overlapping design prevents localized compromise. If one inspector is bought or compromised, 3 others are already looking at the exact same data from a different angle. To function, these inspectors hold supreme operational power, unhindered, real-time access to all classified materials and state secrets. This absolute visibility explicitly destroys the executive's ability to use national security as a legal firewall. Stripping the monopoly on secrecy permanently removes the dark environment required for a shadow government. We translate this architectural structure into mathematical behavioral incentives, treating state corruption as an economic calculation. This UI displays Becker's equation of corruption. It is the mathematical formula determining whether a state official breaks the law. The core variables are the expected gain from the crime, the probability of being caught, and the severity of the penalty. State corruption initiates only when the expected utility of the crime yields a positive mathematical result. Traditional governments fail to stop this because executives artificially lower both the probability of capture and the severity of the penalty by controlling the investigators. The control branch's absolute visibility is engineered to drive the probability of capture towards certainty, removing the executive's ability to hide behind secrecy. To guarantee the equation stays negative, the final variable, the penalty, must be pushed to an absolute systemic extreme. By engineering an environment where capture is mathematically guaranteed, the expected utility of forming a shadow government plummets, making corruption economically irrational. There is one final vulnerability. Corrupt executives often use their term in office to simply run out the clock on the statute of limitations. This mechanism represents the Immortal Prosecutor, a relentless systemic failsafe designed explicitly to close the timeline loophole exploited by corrupt executives. This entity is a lifetime appointed official housed entirely within the independent control branch. They are structurally immune to the executive. They cannot be fired, defunded, or redirected. The prosecutor has a singular, specific mandate: auditing and prosecuting the past actions of former state executives. The critical legal mechanism making this possible is the permanent abolition of the statute of limitations. These specific offenses are classified as crimes against democracy, encompassing high-level corruption and election manipulation. Removing the statute of limitations alters the timeline of accountability. Temporary executive power becomes strategically useless. In traditional systems, outlasting a political term guarantees a corrupt official's freedom. The clock saves them. An immortal legal entity neutralizes the primary advantage of temporary political power. The executive can never simply wait out the justice system. Returning to the penalty variable in Becker's equation, we have to define what constitutes an absolute deterrent. Standard penalties, like brief prison sentences or standard fines, are treated merely as the cost of doing business by state-level oligarchs. The required mathematical infinity for the penalty variable is total asset confiscation. The mechanics are absolute: the complete stripping of all global accumulated wealth and resources from the corrupt executive. This total financial reset extends outward, neutralizing the operational capital of the entire shadow government network that supported them. Elevating the penalty to total financial annihilation turns the hijacking of the state apparatus from a lucrative prize into an existential trap. This diagram illustrates the psychological reality of a sitting executive operating within this newly engineered architecture. Politicians must now make daily decisions, knowing an immortal, independent auditor is waiting precisely for their term to expire. This dynamic establishes a negative feedback loop in statecraft, forcing the machine to regulate itself through constant, independent observation. The combination of the control branch's total data visibility and the immortal prosecutor's relentless timeline inherently stabilizes the state machine. A shadow government is not defeated by pleading for better leaders or relying on moral character. It is defeated by ruthlessly engineering an environment where corruption is an escapable mathematical trap.